Welcome to the Science of Compassion Conference. Is it day 3? I'm particularly honored today to begin this session. I don't think for any of the scientists here today I need to give a long introduction of Dr. Dan Batson. This is an individual who throughout his entire career has delved to understand the fundamental issues related to compassion and altruism. And I believe many of you would acknowledge that, in fact, he is the father of this emerging field, and his contributions to understanding altruism, also the parsing of empathy, and giving us a much richer understanding of many of the components of these things which all of us are so interested. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Batson.
As Jim said, I'm honored to be able to chair this session on measures of compassion. It's a topic that has certainly been of interest and importance to me for a long time. And clearly, if we're going to have a science of compassion, the topic of this conference, we're going to need to have at least some sense, ideally as clear a sense as possible, of what compassion is. We spent some time yesterday, some very useful time, I think, talking and thinking about that. I think we may need to do some more talking and thinking before we're done, but we made a good start. We need to be able to recognize compassion, and we need to be able to measure it. But how? Again, we made some starts yesterday, I think, because certainly most of the presentations had examples of measures of compassion in them. As I tried to think about it, and actually thinking about this context, I was reminded of an occasion a number of years ago where I was on a stage sort of like this, in a room about this size, giving a guest lecture in an introductory psychology class to about 300 or 400 students out there. And the lecture was on bystander intervention in emergencies. And when I got to the part where I was explaining about diffusion of responsibility and group influence on helping, that is the idea that if when you encounter someone in distress, you know that there are others also who are aware of this person's distress, then you're actually less likely to help the person than if you were alone. Basic idea, very familiar. Well, when I got to that point, I sort of hesitated, and I actually was walking. I can't do that here, but I was out on the stage out there, and I kind of stuttered a little bit and stumbled and fell. Thud. I'll leave it to your imagination what happened next. Was that a measure of compassion? Well, if it was, then we might think about what would happen if I or one of the speakers collapsed today. Would we get a different pattern of behavior? I should tell you that if one of us does collapse, as far as I know, it's not a staged event. If my collapse was not a measure of compassion, then how can we measure it? Well, today we have 5 distinguished experts that will talk about different possible measures of compassion to give us some idea, and we'll try to focus on the whole notion of how one might measure compassion. The indicators will include behavioral measures, facial expression, and other indicators of emotion, self-report measures, physiological measures. So we're going to get a bit of a range. And as Jim said, I'm going to try to keep us on a fairly tight leash here. And so each speaker, I've asked them to introduce themselves briefly when they come up, and then they'll talk for 15 minutes each. And once everybody has spoken, then we'll have a chance to have discussion where we'll have some in the panel, and then we'll try to get you all involved. Okay, so that's the basic format. And what I would like to do is just give you the order of the speakers, because it's not the same as in the program, because I wanted to give it some sort of structure if possible. And so we're going to work roughly from outside in, that is, outside the person inside. So we're going to start with behavioral measures. Bob Levine will talk about the kindness of strangers, particularly in different cities. Erica Rosenberg will talk about measuring emotions as indicators of compassion, particularly facial expression and other indicators. Kristen Neff will talk about her well-known measures of self-compassion. And then Walter Osaka will talk about lack of self-compassion in children and subsequent cardiovascular disease, so longitudinal element. And then Barb Fredrickson will talk about autonomic assessment of the heart's capacity for love. And so that's the sequence we'll go through, and then we'll have a chance to talk. So Bob, let me start with you.
I welcome everybody. I thank you for getting up so early on a Saturday morning, and it's my pleasure to begin to give the opening talk of this symposium on measuring compassion. It's a tough cookie. We're being asked to essentially put numbers on one of the most subjective, amorphous notions that I think that I can certainly think about. I've been asked to give a brief introduction, and my name is Bob Levine, and I am a social psychologist. And and I'm not very good at using Macs, so I've lost my picture here. What I would like to do today is to talk about a sort of a way of measuring compassion that may be somewhat different than what we usually think of compassion. I think when most of us use that word compassion, we're talking about something very, very inside the person. And I'm going to talk as a hack social psychologist about compassion in the sense of compassionate places. I want to give a bit of an overview of where I'm coming from here. For those of you who were fortunate enough to hear Paul Ekman's talk yesterday, yesterday morning, you know that he talked about this typology of compassion that he's presenting, familiar, and then getting on to the most difficult to measure and the most difficult to elicit types of compassion. Strangers and sentient, and I'm going to be talking about helpfulness towards strangers. I'm beginning with the notion that there are differences in helpfulness as a function of place. I believe that places, like people, have personalities. This notion of a personality of a place is imperfect, of course, but it's no less imperfect than when we talk about the personality of a person. It's no less consistent, it's no less stable, but I think we all know that there's something there. You know, you come to Telluride, you come back from Telluride, what was it like? Oh, the people were really blank. One goes to New York, oh, the people were such and such. Dan Batson, who'll hopefully talk a little bit about what it means to have a fast-paced place and a slow-paced place, can help us with all that. So, as I say, I want to give a brief introduction. I was asked to give a brief introduction to myself, and I'm going to give the introduction in the form of a couple of quick anecdotes. I grew up in New York City. I live in a smaller place now. I grew up in New York City. I grew up in a place where I saw scenes like this all my life. It became commonplace as a child to walk by people like this. These are the kind of scenes that we see in every major city today. I knew about it when I was 3 years old, 4 years old, and it always struck me that the very people that I depended on for my best values, people who taught me about compassion, who taught me about helping the underdog, about social justice, these were same people who would teach me when I was walking by scenes like this, that you can't stop. The mantras of the city were, the great mantras of growing up to New York to me were, you can't get involved and you can't get too close. It's really a shame, but you never know what's going to happen to people. Well, I want to fast forward to another scene. This was as a young adult. I was traveling in Rangoon, Burma at the time, now Myanmar, of course. And I was at a market there. I'd actually been traveling around Asia for about a year. And I got to this market, and I felt like I was in a Joseph Conrad novel. It was hot, it was dirty, there were bugs all over, there was poverty every place, nobody was selling anything to anybody. And at one moment, some guy gets up and screams out, falls down, apparently had a heart attack, I'm going to assume. And what I watched happen there was something that looked like people have been rehearsing it their whole lives. Somebody comes from one of their booths and they put something under his head. Another person takes charge, kind of guards the place, and pushes people away. Another person goes off to find some kind of medical assistance. Somebody else is waving a fan, and yet, you know, I felt like I was watching the lab practicals for a paramedic center, it made me think more about what was going on in these places, the personality of these places. Was I going to conclude that the people in Burma, these people in Rangoon, are nicer people than the people in New York? I didn't feel that way. I didn't think that was the answer. But nonetheless, what I was observing there was, if I had a problem, if I fell down on a stage and I wasn't preparing people for and I hadn't framed this event as a compassion festival, where would have I had a better chance of being helped? So what happened was, I had the good fortune at a later age to become a grown-up sort of social psychologist. And I decided I wanted to measure these things. I wanted to go to different places. I wanted to look at different places. And I wanted to see if I could systematically measure the likelihood that a stranger would receive help in different places. I've asked several questions in this work. One is, are some places truly more helpful than others? Is this just anecdotal evidence, or can we systematically make these conclusions? And the answer to that, I can tell you right now, is yes. Second, the Thomas Wolfe quote about all cities bringing out the worst in people. Is it just population size? Is that what does it? Is that the main predictor? Well, if I have enough cities, if I look at enough cities, then what I can do is I can look at other characteristics of these places, and I can now do correlations between my helping measures and these other characteristics of cities. I'm treating cities as a subject. Now, for those of you who are biological scientists, who are looking at science on a more micro level, you're going to hate the way that I measure this stuff, because I'm using a sledgehammer. I am treating cities as subjects. If I do that, though, then I can look at these other kind of characteristics of communities, and I can see, is there something that's a more important predictor? And of course, the next step in that is, if I can find these predictors, then perhaps I can turn it around. I can do something about these conditions. So we've tried to come up with different ways of measuring helpfulness, the theme of this symposium. And I've used a number of different measures over time. Some of these you'll see in this quick video clip that I'm going to show in a moment. We go into downtown areas and cities. We try to do it under the same conditions, same time of day, same time of year. We tap people walking alone as best we can. And we look at what would happen if this guy dropped the magazine. People act the role of a blind person. Will they get help crossing the street? Somebody drops a pen and we see what happens. We've also looked at we hold out a quarter. Can I have change for a quarter? A measure, by the way, that doesn't work in the United States anymore, because people look at quarters like, they move their wallet to their front pocket as soon as I ask them that. We've used the well-established lost letter technique, where I address a letter to myself. I put a letter inside, I put a fresh stamp on it, and then we accidentally lose the letter. The easiest, the most relaxed form of data collection that I've ever done. You then come home, you make yourself a cappuccino, and you wait for the mailman every day. And we've looked at an indirect measure. I might say, since we're talking about how to measure helping, that as much as these are convenience measures, I have tried to put them into some sort of systematic form. Try to take a taxonomy of helping and try to sample types of helping that are somewhat representative of the larger range of possibilities. I'm missing some. I'm missing in particular helping in emergency situations. So we've done this in a number of cities across the United States. We've also done it around the world, and I thought I'd just show you a brief clip that'll give you a look at what happened in one of these U.S. studies.
Scientists, of course, to measure things. Can a social scientist measure civility? Maybe. The blind man waiting for help to cross the street? Well, he's not a blind man. He's a graduate student named Gary Braze, doing research on civility. Some people walk on by.
Green light, sir.
Thank you.
Some stop and help. Gary and other students originally sampled civility in 36 cities. They repeated the test for us in New York, that's this corner, and further upstate in Rochester, where this woman went out of her way to help.
May I help you across the street? Which way did you want to go, sir?
Going this way.
This is Broad.
Yeah.
Want to go down Broad? All right.
In New York's Grand Central Station and in Rochester, Gary tried some other tests, asking change for a quarter. Rochester.
Excuse me, do you have change for a quarter? No. I don't know.
Grand Central Station.
Excuse me, do you have a quarter for 25 cents? Okay.
There are tricks to the trade. Ask single people, try to make eye contact.
Excuse me, could I get a quarter for 25 cents?
They don't always work. Another test. Gary puts on a leg brace, the ugliest one he could find. He can't bend over easily. He drops some magazines. Will people help pick them up? Rochester.
I'll get it.
Thank you.
No problem. There you go.
In Rochester, people raced to be helpful.
Thank you.
New Yorkers were a little more standoffish, but some did help. The last test. Gary drops a ballpoint pen. Will people tell him or pick it up and hand it to him? Rochester.
Oh, thanks.
This counts as super helpful.
Oh, thank you.
In Grand Central, some people ignored the pen. This man pointed out the pen, asked for money, and offered to sell drugs. Some people returned the pen. This man saw the pen and thought about giving it back. Then he kept it. This New Yorker never met a ballpoint he didn't like. By now, you've figured out that New York got the lowest test scores on the civility scale and Rochester the highest. Here's how some other cities ranked. Robert Levine of Cal State Fresno, who conducted the study, says population density was the key. The more densely populated the city, the worse.
That's a sampling of the sorts of things that we found. And I'll just say right now, we've done this across the United States. We've done it around the world. I'll give you, my website is www.boblevine.net for anybody who wants to download some more information about the findings. I'm not going to take the time to give the list, which will certainly give us a great deal to discuss. Mostly what I've been interested in is what are the predictors, what are the best predictors, and what are some of the consequences of it? And just to give you a very brief overview of it, we know that smaller population size as expected are predictors. Population density is even more important. In fact, if we look at population density, it accounts for everything and more that's accounted by population size. Population change is important, seems to be a significant predictor, at least in the United States. Economy works in the other direction, and this is something that we'll have to leave open for a longer discussion. As Dan Batson here, the man who can tell us more than anybody about this. Slower pace of life. People with slow pace of life are more likely to be helpful. And just one other finding that I want to throw out and just leave it here is that crime rates don't predict very, very well. So now these are the crime rates of a city and individual people. But when we ask people in big cities, where there isn't very much helping, when we ask them about why they didn't help, they often point to fear, and this is just something to think about. I'm running into seconds here left that I can talk, but so I just want to throw out one other quick point. Paul Ekman was talking about concern versus action. Thupten Jimpo was talking about whether compassion always arises through the empathy route. I want to give you one little anecdote here from the lost letter, if you'll bear with me on this. The difference between the helpfulness of a place, and compassion in people. One of the lost letters, I would get notes back on them. This particular one read, I found this on my windshield. This is from Rochester, where someone put it with a note saying they found it on my car. I thought it was something in the mailbox. And blah, blah, blah. By the way, do you know any Levines in New Jersey or Long Island? I want you to contrast this to, this is a letter I got back from somebody in New York. The side was open. But the letter was still in there, and it came back with a note on it that, as one of my Hispanic friends said, oh, Bobby, he said something very bad about your mother. This was on the side of it. So now, I try to imagine this person, what's going on with this guy? It's a guy, right? It has to be a guy. He's taking this to the mailbox. He hates me. The man, not only not compassionate, he hates me for making him do this. The difference between helping and not helping. But the deed was done. So that's a bit about measuring the compassion of places. And I thank you.